Joining me for the Sitch, contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, author of the book Undoing Drugs, The Untold Story of Harm Reduction and the Future of Addiction. Please welcome Maia Szalavitz. Hi, Maia.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I feel like the last time you were on, we were in the midst of the Adderall shortage, which was also affecting my household. And there was, and we're so much better now. Now everything's fine. No, but we were talking about, God, a bunch of things, and now so much hasn't changed and in fact gotten worse. But I guess the one thing I wanted to pick up on from the thread and I have a bunch of questions for you, but the thread we left last time was, you, I think, very succinctly explained the ways in which the use of opioids or street drugs like fentanyl had to do with the kind of whiplash of rescinding, Oxycontin scripts, and obviously the overprescription of an opioid ultimately that was a pharmaceutical. And we all know that was bad, but also so is not having any kind of treatment, rather completely, making it inaccessible to folks who are addicted. And now we have RFK Jr. at the head of HHS. And I just wanted to ask you, because one of the things I've been saying, on Piers Morgan or wherever, is that I'm very concerned about him possibly rescinding antidepressant scripts. And, I can just throw this up here. This is from The Hill. He's claimed that serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, can be more addictive than heroin, which he is a longtime recovering addict, and has falsely linked them to school shootings. He avoided denouncing the belief about shootings during his confirmation hearing, only saying, quote, "I don't think anybody can answer that question." I think they can. And he also said nothing's going to be off limits when it comes to scrutinizing things like antidepressants. He named childhood vaccine schedules, psychiatric drugs, and environmental issues. We've talked a lot about the vaccines, and all that, but like the psychiatric meds, can you just explain whether I have cause to be concerned about what impact this could do when you limit the accessibility of SSRIs, or what is your take?
It's just a terrible idea. When we stopped so-called overprescribing of opioids, when we cut back the prescribing by about half, overdose rates quadrupled. If there was a chart I was just looking at this morning that shows the rate when we were in the height of the prescription opioid crisis, and it's minuscule compared to what we have seen from cutting people off of the drugs and arriving at fentanyl.
Right.
The good news is that we are finally starting to see some decline in the overdose death rate. The bad news is that probably a significant proportion of that decline has to do with the fact that most of the people at risk are probably already dead. And that is just super depressing. And, people in the field have just lost so many family members, friends, lovers, partners, people,
Yeah.
100,000 a year for the last few years.
Insane.
So yeah, it's absolutely crazy. And in the days of the prescription opioid crisis, it was about 20 to 30,000 a year. So still horrible. Obviously, we shouldn't be, losing people to this, but much, much worse. And when you cut people off from prescription medications, which for all their flaws, we have an FDA for a reason. We have an FDA because otherwise people sell poison to you, as we can see in the fentanyl crisis.
Yes.
And we have an FDA so that you know the dose and the purity of what you're taking. There's a saying that regulations are written in blood. This is really clear from drug regulations. And when you do things like take away medications that are working for people, you end up harming them a lot.
Yeah.
Now, what's crazy with the situation with SSRIs, and I'm probably a person who's going to get sent to a work camp for my Prozac addiction. But, that's a complete misunderstanding of what addiction is. Addiction is compulsive drug use despite negative consequences. Dependence is physically needing something to function. If you're we're all dependent on like air and food and water. Dependence isn't a problem if the stuff keeps you alive.
Mm-hmm.
Dependence is a problem if people are trying to get between you and the substance, or if the substance is harming you.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you confuse addiction and dependence, you can make stupid statements like Prozac is more addictive than heroin. First of all, the withdrawals from opioids are actually worse than from SSRIs, but that's not to say that you cannot have withdrawals from SSRIs. The thing about it is, I forget to take my Prozac sometimes.
Right.
I never forgot to take my heroin. Right. And that's in a nutshell right there. Like at this point, nobody's robbing drugstores to get Prozac. But if you take it away from the people that it is standing between their depression and their functioning, you may see that, but not in the way that you would see with something like an opioid.
Right. And it might turn folks to even illicit drugs, right? If you can't get a prescription for an antidepressant, or you can't fulfill your script, like you could go to street drugs or relapse or whatever it might be. I don't know. I'm saying like if you were an addict.
Absolutely. Yes. No, I mean, people with addiction, it's quite clear if you cut them off from opioids, for example, methadone and buprenorphine, which are used for treatment, those cut the death rate in half. If you take away those medications, you are doubling the death rate. And, he hasn't explicitly spoken about taking away those medications, but he hasn't been promoting them. And frankly, when you have two medications that cut the death rate from something as lethal as opioid addiction, the most lethal condition in psychiatry, more lethal than anorexia or anything else, and you want to take away the stuff that cuts the death rate in half. Now, we don't have as clear figures for like somebody like me who has depression, and that depression was like underlying my opioid addiction. But I would imagine that if you take people's antidepressants away, you will see more suicide and you will see more overdose deaths as people relapse. And it's quite clear, for example, that when people were concerned that antidepressants were being overprescribed to teenagers, and that this was increasing their risk of suicide, and they put a black box warning on it now to say, hey, this could potentially increase the risk. After they did that, prescribing fell and suicide increased. So now this is not to say that there aren't rare instances in which SSRIs can make some people either suicidal or even potentially more violent because of a condition called akathisia that often happens. When it happens, it tends to happen right when you start taking the medication. So if you want to prevent this problem, monitor people when they start the medication. And if they show any signs of this, stop the medication. This will solve this problem. The thing about antidepressants and actually opioids, like people just have an enormous variety of responses to medications. So I might take opioids and they make me feel warm and safe and loved. You might take it and it makes you feel numb and nauseous and awful.
Sure.
And similarly with an SSRI, it might make I'm somebody who's sort of naturally bouncing off the ceiling with intensity. It calms me down.
Right. But this is,
go ahead.
I mean, this is part and parcel of, this Maha like wellness BS, which is the idea that everything's synthetic, even though these drugs are created from nature and from science, that everything synthetic is bad. And all we need to do is like cod liver oil our way out of depression. And I'm sure, you and many others can attest to the fact that that's not going to work for them. So I think it's also this obsession with children, in my opinion, that comes first. When it comes to anti-trans stuff, it's this obsession with children. And yet really, as we see in states, like Florida and others, which are blocking hormone, gender affirming care for all trans people, like it's really not about meds for children. It's about all people. It's about this ideology that any pharmaceuticals are bad for you because
except ivermectin. Ivermectin.
And Ozempic.
Oh, no, he's opposed to Ozempic.
Oh, is he anti? Oh, but
Yeah.
pro steroids, I guess,
Oh, right. Yes.
and hormones.
Testosterone for men, okay. Women, illegal.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Oh my god.
Or trans
You
people.
wanna you wanna see a revolution, yeah, strip away all the hormones from, menopausal women.
Oh my God. Well, also, like, I really, one of the things that's scary in the many, many, many scary things is that the DEA wants a national registry of everybody's prescriptions.
Excuse
Um,
me? I'm sorry, could you just what?
yeah, the DEA wants a national registry of everybody's controlled substance prescriptions. So if you're fine with estrogen because that's not controlled, testosterone is controlled, as are anti-anxiety meds like Xanax and opioids, et cetera, and stimulants for ADHD, et cetera. I always say that if you want to think about this clearly, let's put Viagra on that national registry.
Oh, yeah.
Right? They will stop it for privacy concerns when it comes to a drug like that. When it comes to things that other people might be embarrassed about, no, no, no. They want to know, and they want to be, inside our data and, using things to be able to abuse people, basically.
Use them, criminalize them, right? I mean, this happens all the time. I guess I want to talk about, before we move on from the decrease in fentanyl deaths, overdose deaths, which you wrote about at the end of last year for the New York Times. Um, you I want to just ask you to explain a little bit more about why it's not necessarily a good sign. It's not because, as you write, there's a lot of access to treatments like methadone, and other things. It's not that, but can you explain a little bit more about like where the decrease is happening and where it's not?
Sure. So the good news is that sort of the decrease has, in general, followed the path of fentanyl. So that like fentanyl spread from the East Coast to the West Coast, and now the decline in deaths is spreading. And what that suggests is that people are adapting to its presence in the market, but it takes a little while. And one thing that we really do need to give people credit for is there has been a huge increase in access to naloxone, which is the drug that reverses overdose. And people in harm reduction introduced this drug to the general public. Before that, you could only get it in hospitals or ambulances or from police. Now anybody can get it. It's over the counter. And this is thanks to like the harm reduction movement and the hard work that all these people have been doing to just get it out there. So that has clearly made a difference to some extent. The sort of sad side of the problem is, first of all, that it's still such a high rate. And second of all, that Black people and Native Americans in particular are still seeing increases. And what that says to me is that those populations are experiencing more harm from criminalization, for example, like because going to jail massively increases your overdose risk, and less harm reduction because we know that actually Black people and American Indians have less access to naloxone and other harm reduction services and treatment. So, I mean, ironically, because we claim that arresting people is like the way to get people into treatment and we need to do more arrests because we need to get more people into treatment. Well, if arrests were the best way to get into treatment, Black people and American Indians should have the highest rate of treatment access, which is not the case. And it is just, we just keep making the same mistakes over and over again. We just keep thinking that, addiction is defined as compulsive use that continues despite negative outcomes. That's basically continuing despite punishment. We continue to use punishment to try to stop a problem defined by its resistance to punishment. So this is really smart.
Yes, yeah. Before we talk about Trump, I did want to ask, about what the impacts actually maybe of the Trump administration are, not on this issue, but just beyond the issue. But seeing the cuts that are coming down the pike on Medicaid, seeing the cuts that are coming down the pike on SNAP and food benefits and subsidies, seeing the cuts to Social Security checks that maybe slowed down, or if not stopped, as Trump and the administration continue to peddle the lie that there are people who are 150 years old who are getting their Social Security checks. It might feel really obvious, but can you just explain to everyone how these kinds of cuts will impact drug use, the, and the epidemic that we've already seen and that we're dealing with?
Sure. So oftentimes drug epidemics are caused by things like deindustrialization, where people lose their jobs and people have less access to hope and a sense of a meaningful future.
Yeah.
Basically, the more miserable you are and the more your life sucks, the more likely you are to become addicted to something, which is kind of obvious when you think about it, because drugs make people feel better, at least at first.
Right.
So the more you make people's life suck, the more addiction you will see. And we've seen that, in everything from crack to the opioid crisis, to, pretty much any time you see a drug crisis, behind it is a socioeconomic crisis. Now, that's not to say that that's the only cause of addiction, because obviously middle class, rich people, et cetera, become addicted all the time.
Yeah.
But when you destroy the middle class and you destroy people's sense of having a future, it is not surprising that you will see worse drug problems. The other issue, when we talk about Medicaid and Medicare specifically, they are the number one funder of addiction treatment. So if you take away Medicaid and you do things like, oh, you have to work to get Medicaid, then people aren't going to have access to treatment. Yeah. And without access to treatment, you will see more deaths and you will see less recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. To say nothing of the fact that like most people on Medicaid are already working. So, but you're absolutely right. It's like if you actually cared, this goes to Trump, about the fentanyl crisis, the opioid epidemic, the only vehicle to actually fund treatment, if you cared about people, which I would argue they don't, would be through things like Medicaid, would be through things like Medicare, would be through things like these public health services that we have that are now being, on the chopping block, put on the chopping block. But
no,
let's just...
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say they think that like, oh, we'll just stop the supply from Canada, which isn't happening, and from Mexico. And the reality is it would take 1 to 2 tractor trailer trucks to supply the entire United States opioid using population with fentanyl for a year. Think about the 70.
That's a little, right? That's not that much.
No. It's a tiny amount.
Yeah.
It's very small. It's like 50 to 100 times. Some of these things are 10,000 times stronger than heroin. Like right. It makes looking for a needle in a haystack look like an easy thing. And so unless you want to shut down international trade, which by the way, kind of happened during the pandemic and fentanyl still got through, this is not a thing that you can solve by prohibition. And I mean, the irony here is that the one time we did have total control over the supply, i.e. the DEA has total control over the medical supply of opioids in the United States, we created a crisis nonetheless.
Right.
So the idea that you could like fix this by like, bombing cartels or something like that, like we have had various forms of prohibition for hundreds of years. When people want a substance, they get it. This is called capitalism. We usually are in favor of it.
Well, let's talk about that because we're going to talk about trade a little bit later. But on this idea, the classifying cartels as terrorist organizations. Now, I've had Johan Grillo on, who talks all about cartel violence on this show and the drug war. And he will openly admit that the things that some of these cartels are engaged in, the levels of violence, are very terroristic in and of themselves, the communities that they terrorize and all of this. But designating them as a foreign terrorist organization, truly further militarizing this drug war, what is that going to mean for ordinary people? I mean, what is that going to mean for, I don't know, like nonviolent, like low-level dealers or addicts themselves, or just like our overall safety? Like, do you
I mean, there are ways to like use law enforcement against cartels that are more effective. Still, it's not the most effective way of dealing with drug problems, but if you wanted to, if you focus on the violence and the harm and the banking, you will do much You
Yes.
will do much better than if you try to say like bomb some labs or just like, because if you just take like, oh, we'll just take the kingpins out, you can replace them in 5 minutes. And in fact, when Mexico did that, when they took them out, they ended up with worse violence and more gangs because people are now fighting over those massive profits. It is not an easy problem, but the way to deal with this stuff is more rule of law and more focus on trying to help people not become gangsters,
Right.
than on okay, we'll take out this cartel, because you take out this one, you're going to end up with another one unless you solve the problem of demand. And there's always going to be a demand to some extent. And the way we deal with that, a drug policy expert that I sometimes massively disagreed with, but sometimes agreed with, used to say that like the absolute worst system for drug control is prohibition. The second worst is commercialization. In between there is where we find the ways that can minimize harm.
I actually, I wanted to, I don't know if we talked about this the last time you were on, but when I did a report on Uruguay's legalization of marijuana. They exactly did what you were saying, sort of studying the models that fully commercialized, like in the United States, that sort of like, yay, now weed is in gummies, and, gummies are literally, children's candy. And again, not to sound like a conservative, but, we do, Uruguay had a massive alcoholism problem, and alcohol was on every corner. And so it was like, how do we responsibly regulate marijuana in a way that can keep children safe, but then also redirect the funds, because it was actually government, not government land that was growing the marijuana. How can we redirect the funds that we make from that into drug treatment programs? And that's exactly what they did. I'm definitely due for a check-in. Uruguay is also it is a country of 3 million people. It's small, 3.3 or something. But like, again, like this is there are shades of gray. It's not just full blown. I believe in legalization, but yes, the commercialization is not necessarily always a smart way to go. But that's
No. And I mean, like with marijuana, you can argue that if we're going to have commercial alcohol, we should have commercial marijuana to sort of compete with it, since it's less harmful. But again, it's right. It's all in the nuance. It's all in the shades of gray. It's all in the way you regulate either effectively or you make things worse.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about then the tariffs, right? And the claim. Again, you were talking about, fentanyl's really easy to traffic. You need very small amounts to make a very potent drug. And that going after like steel, as if fentanyl is being, tucked away into the beams, is just the most ham-fisted, dumbass idea, obviously, that affects all of us. We're going to talk about what it's doing for the economy, later. But what, like, you've sort of laid this out, but like, what if you really wanted to go after this illicit market? Can you?
Well, I mean, one of the ways to do better is to make it a lot easier for people to get safer substitutes. So make buprenorphine like available over the counter, even potentially. Like, make it as easy for people to get the safer substances as it is to get things like fentanyl. Because if when and again, like, this is hard to do, but in Liverpool in the UK, when they had a sort of massive heroin problem during the 80s, they started prescribing heroin. They had some prescribing already, but they expanded it. And that actually worked because it outcompeted the drug dealers. You made it such that like people could get a, pure stuff without, supplying other people with it. Yeah. And so like, because a lot of dealing, and this is certainly was true in my case, is like people who just want to like have a supply for themselves. Yeah. And so if you take away that incentive, you get rid of a lot of the market. But this is, this is not what we're talking. And I mean, the tariff thing is also so crazy because it is, destroying a lot of people's ability to make a living, which is not a good thing if you want to have less addiction.
Yeah, no, it's crushing the economy and everyone is feeling the effects. Lastly, before I let you go, when it comes to messaging, I've been very obsessed since, the Democrats lost in 2024, the lack of messaging from the party. And you can see it now, the lack of response to the kinds of openly fascistic acts that we are seeing. But when it comes to drug addiction, opioid deaths, Democrats seem to be such a zero as to like what they stand for, what they believe the way out is. It seems to be very like, again, tone deaf to things like harm reduction that have, as you mentioned, given us these drugs that have saved lives. What kind of message, dreaming up a politician, dreaming up a message, what kind of message around these issues would you like to hear coming from an opposition party that actually is serious about saving lives?
Well, we have medications that can cut the death rate in half. We have policies that are starting to work, like giving out more naloxone. We know that the drug war is a failure. 4 or 5 years ago, everybody was admitting that, including the Republicans. We should be standing up in favor of the stuff that we actually know works and that we've seen working. We should not be backing, Democrats just backed off on things like decriminalization. There is zero evidence that arresting people for drug possession does anything other than waste money and make people more likely to die and less likely to recover. Nobody stood up for it because they just got scared back into drug war.
Yep.
Drug war was seen until very recently as a universally failed policy. But now it's like, Trump's people are saying that like, oh, this isn't a trade war, it's a drug war, as if that's a good thing. Both of those things are unwinnable. But, it's like, come on, like we actually know stuff that works. Addiction is actually one of the most treatable mental illnesses. Like most people recover if you just keep them alive. So there's all kinds of good messaging we could be doing, but we are afraid to stand up for what works because we have let these attacks, oh, you're soft, as if like being soft and kind isn't what actually does help.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's broadly like focusing on humanizing drug addicts as if we don't all know and love somebody, you know, who survived and made it out, and we want to see more of that. And or have seen or have lost people who never did, which I think is much more common these days. So, again, the Republicans are in the business of dehumanize and criminalize. And so we have to be in the business of humanizing and smartly regulating and helping.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking about what about the children, I mean, we should be looking, how do we help kids avoid becoming addicted? We spend money on them. We do things like provide like lots of after school activities and parks and sports and, things for kids who don't like sports. And this works. Like Iceland has had a remarkable success with doing drug prevention that basically consists of super duper fabulous after school activities for everybody. Again, is this sexy? No, it is not. But it's actually
it depends on what the production is.
Well, that's true.
You don't know. It might be Chicago with kids. That'd be weird.
Okay, and the drama kids do need their stuff
Trust
too.
me. Yeah. But as a stoner drama kid, I can tell you, it doesn't always keep you off drugs, but off the harder ones, absolutely. What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/bitchuationroom. Do